Welcome to Unmasking the Mic. My name is Ralph Anthony, current stand-up comedian and actor living in New York City. Each week I'll be sitting down with a fellow comedian to discuss how they navigate the world and how being in therapy helps aid them in that journey. Thanks for tuning in. Now let the unmasking begin. Welcome back to another episode of Unmasking the Mic. I'm your host, Ralph Anthony, and today my guest is New York City-based comedian Michael Clayton. Mike has been featured in the North Carolina Comedy Festival as well as the Fifth Borough Comedy Festival. Thank you for coming on today, Mike. How you doing?
Thank you so much. And that's a smooth intro. I love it.
Thank you. I'm trying to get better about them. The intro is always the hardest part, I feel like.
Yeah, it's it's so weird. It's even like, from doing stand-up, one of the hardest things for me is always just starting a set. Like once you're into it, you're good. But like, it's always that intro where it's like, why am I going to convince these people they need to listen to me in the first place? Like,
oh, yeah. It's like, please just listen. Please like me. I swear I'm not fucking creepy. Like, yeah, man. It's honestly, it's very similar to doing stand-up because it's like, you have the idea of where you want to go with everything. And not only do you want to almost keep the person you're interviewing captivated, but you also want to keep the people that are going to be listening captivated as well. And so it's a nice little like two-way balance.
Well, it's also weird because there's that quote, and I can't remember who says it, but somebody said, can you be funny or can you be funny at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday? And the idea is that like, yeah, we can all be humorous or entertaining in the context of a conversation, but to literally go, click on this link, it is a conversation I had and it's worth your time. That's a bold statement. And that's something that like you have to kind of have the confidence of knowing you're providing something people will find interesting. And that's, we're all insecure as comics. So I think overcoming that is always a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like you deal with something like mental health. And it's very strange because people sometimes still get, apprehensive about it. They're like, I don't know. I feel uncomfortable talking about how I'm uncomfortable. And it's so weird sometimes. But people have been really, they like this. They like having the conversations. They like coming on, I should say, and doing the interviews. But people that are listening, I've been getting some really positive feedback. So it feels good. It feels really good because I think mental health is something that is vastly undervalued in our country. Certainly don't put enough effort into it.
I would completely agree. I remember having a conversation with my sister recently, and this is going to be a weird kind of segue, but stay with me. We were talking about mass shootings, which we were both very frustrated about. And like, there's been far too many of them over the last couple of years. And my sister asked, like, what do I think the problem is? And of course, I'm an advocate for certain gun control measures and things like that. I'm up for all that. But I said, even though I'm for all that, one of the big things that I think is a problem is it's predominantly males that are doing the shootings. And I think there's an entire generation of men that don't know how to express their feelings properly.
Yeah.
And I think there's a tremendous amount of toxicity that's happened as a result of that. And I'm not trying to make like, this is not an anti-male sort of thing. I think we're all very vulnerable. And I think we're taught not to express that. And I don't know that that's a good path. And I think there's a lot of work we all have to do to kind of deconstruct that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's one of my favorite things to talk about because men have been taught that you can't cry, you can't express your emotions, you have to wear this armored plate on your chest. If you show any form of emotion, it's considered a weakness. And that's a huge problem. I literally just started writing a joke about how I think it's manly to cry. Honestly, it's white guys. We're the fucking problem. Problem. Straight white males from age, I would say 18 to 20, all the way up to about mid 40s to 50. We're the problem. That 25-year, 30-year age gap, that's where all these shooters are coming from. And I think if a white guy goes into a gun store to go buy a gun, they should be giving him a box of tissues instead of a box of bullets.
I like that.
Just in case, just in case you don't need the gun, you just need a good cry. Like, that's really what it is.
Absolutely. And I think more and more, I think it's becoming more accepted, which I'm very, very happy about, even in fields that it typically wouldn't seem to be compatible with. I think it's becoming more productive. You know, this is going to sound weird. I'm a huge pro wrestling fan, and there's been a huge push for mental health in pro wrestling. And it's good because I don't know if you've seen, but over the last 20 years, there's been a high body count people under 40 that have dropped dead. And some of that is just, you know, nature taking its course. Sometimes it was cancer, things like that. But a lot of it was personal demons and, you know, personal mental health struggles. And I'm glad to see any situation where getting a little bit more light shown on that.
Yeah, I think men have been programmed to not want to take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And I say that in the sense where whenever you go to a gym, whether it's one of these high class fancy gyms like an Equinox or like a New York Sports Club or something on the lower end like Planet Fitness, like that's where I go, and you see a bunch of dudes there jacked up, lifting weights, being physically strong and yet very emotionally weak. And you can't, everything has to flow. It's very much like a yin and yang, where you need your mental health, your emotional health, and your physical health, because they all pour into each other like a Venn diagram.
Well, it also becomes this thing that you begin to see when you've experienced certain things like that, then you understand how much harder it is to confront those things than it is to just reject it outright. I listened to your Tracy Carnazzo episode earlier today because I like Tracy a lot, and I know Tracy certainly has had, you know, a go of it in the last year or so. Just, you know, she's been very open about it.
Yeah.
But one of the things is like, I have certainly been in like toxic relationships before, and I know how difficult like leaving those situations are. So like people getting emotional about that, I don't look at that as like a weakness. I look at it as like, damn, I know that's tough. Like, so I actually have like a lot of respect for that. And I think, you know, that personal experience, you know, nothing makes you realize how tough something is until you've personally experienced it yourself. And then you have a lot more empathy for people who have dealt with it in their own context.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. In any toxic relationship I've been in, I have been the toxic one. And that is something that I think people need to admit, because we all have this version of ourselves in our heads. And we all like to think that we portray ourselves in one certain aspect. And it's like, you see yourself one way, but in reality, you could be completely different. Like, I never thought that I was as bad of a boyfriend as I was until I got into therapy, started talking about situations, and my therapist was like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, yeah. Oh my God, you're the one who is creating these situations.
Can I ask a question? Like, I know you're the interviewer, but I like, you're in a healthy relationship now.
Yeah.
And I think you've done a lot of work on yourself to kind of get towards a healthy relationship. Does it feel like this is almost easier than it should be? Why did it take so long for me to kind of get to a place?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
My girlfriend and I, we talk about this because we talk about it because we're very open communicators. And that's really where the healthiness lies. You can't be in a healthy relationship if you don't communicate all the time. And we talk every day, multiple times a day, and not just in text, but FaceTime, phone calls. And anytime something comes up, we talk about it. And that's really how you get ahead of any situation. We're not afraid to hurt the other person's feelings by being honest, because it's just being honest. You're not hurting someone's feelings. I'm a big believer in trying to become egoless. And it was something I learned from meditating about a year and a half ago. And I've been striving to incorporate this in my life every day, where if you have a situation and you feel that angst building up inside of you, you have to ask yourself, is this angst real or is it imaginary? Because chances are it's just your ego that's bruised. It's not the situation, it's yourself. And so going back to what you had said, that's why it feels surreal at times, because we talk so much that anytime we get into these situations, it's gone in a second. That feeling is
Yeah.
gone because I just admitted to her the other day about some stuff where I was just like, hey, listen, you know what? This is on me. This is what was going on. I was like, this is my fault. I was the one who was not respecting the avenues of our relationship, because it's a two-way street.
Yeah. And you find it's weird that a lot of people in culture, like taking accountability for anything is very, very difficult for them. Like, and it was certainly for me too. I've done it long enough now that it's almost become like, it does not become stressful at all for me to take accountability for something. Like, where it's almost like, oh, well, I made a mistake and that's okay. Like, but that just certainly took a lot of work. That took a lot of, time. But I think most people in society going like, I fucked up is something that's very, very difficult for them.
Yeah. And I think it translates to the way that we are raised as kids, because when you screw up as a child, it's looked at as a negative, when children screwing up could actually almost be a positive if you frame it in the way of, this is a learning lesson. I'm reading this book right now. It's called Mindset. It's by this lady called Carol Dweck, and it's the new psychology of success. And in it, the chapter that I'm on talks about parents raising their children and how you have to frame things as learning lessons. And if a child screws up and a finger is pointed at them, there's a punishment. There's no learning lesson that's available. So it just reinforces this negative behavior. And then it just keeps compounding as they get older. And so the willingness to admit fault becomes so monumental that it'll just destroy a relationship.
That it makes a lot of sense. That's one of those like very insightful observations that, like, I don't know that you would come to that on your own, but when somebody says it, it just becomes very apparent and clear.
Yeah. I got this book. I was in an acting program. I had finished up I had gone through an acting conservatory with the Maggie Flanagan studio right here in Manhattan. And this book was one of the suggested readings for the next level, which unfortunately I couldn't afford, but I picked up the book anyway. And I was like, this is very fascinating. I like to think about thinking. And it's really wild how your childhood and how certain situations growing up really just starts rippling throughout your life. And
For sure.
admitting fault was something I would never do. And one valuable lesson I remember hearing years ago was when a manager at work had said, when you point the finger at someone, remember that you have four fingers pointing right back at you.
I like that.
But it's the God's honest truth. So you have to reshape your framework. You have to reshape your mindset, because these are all learned characteristics that we have just grown into, and it's hard to shake. It's hard to break. And I think being in therapy really helps people come to the light. They come to this light, they come to this moment. Holy shit, I could have been living my life a totally different way if I just took ownership of this situation.
Well, and you get more out of life too.
Yeah.
Instead of just, there's all been times where we've just literally existed. And that becomes a very, very somber thing to do. If you're just literally just taking a breath, waking up, going to bed, throwing some food down your gullet, and that's literally your entire existence, that could be very bleak. You gotta address those things so you have things that are worth enjoying in life.
Yeah, totally. And I must say, when I put up that post on Facebook about asking about comics who are, asking which comics are in therapy, there was a lot of female comedians that commented on that post, and you were maybe one of two handfuls of guys. We're talking, I had 50, 60, 70 comments on that thing. And
Sure.
You're one of the few guys that few male comics that commented on it. So it's a testament to you trying to make change and moving forward and embracing what you had just said, embracing a better, more fulfilling life.
I appreciate that. And I am always enthusiastic of anybody that expresses that. I've seen too many relationships destroyed, and I've seen too many people just unhappy, at a certain point. And, you said it so many times on the podcast, and I've said it in just the couple episodes you've had so far, and I've said it my entire life. I don't think there's a single person that can't benefit from therapy. And if somebody says, I don't need therapy, they're usually the ones that I think could benefit the most from it.
Oh my God. Yes. Yeah. And I always find that it's certain situations that force people, if they are like I was very reluctant to go into therapy. I thought it was a dig at who I was and how I existed as a person. And then I hit rock bottom in January of 2018. And the first thing I did was get into therapy. So like, because you're such an adamant because you're such an advocate of mental health, was there a moment in your life that happened where you're just like, I need to speak to a therapist?
So the answer for that is complicated, because there's technically one point, and then there was one point where it got serious. Now, what I find with a lot of people when they go into therapy is there's a point when they start going to a therapist, and then later on, there's a point when they actually start taking therapy seriously. Because the hardest part about therapy is you can go and you could just speak to another person, but if you're not actually using that time and you're not actually using the patient confidentiality to really open up to the therapist, then your time is worthless. I'll say right now, because my parents helped me with therapy early on, because I had depression at a very young age, in my teens. Yeah. And I didn't realize what it was at the time. At first, it was diagnosed as ADD. And then as time went on, it was like, no, this kid's just depressed.
Wow.
And, but what was interesting was I'm a pretty intelligent person, and I've seen enough portrayals of how people communicate with therapists. You kind of know what you can say to a therapist to just get them off your back enough. It's like, okay, if I give them enough crumbs this way, then they won't touch on this.
Yeah.
And there were years that I did that because I was very insecure about actually sharing the parts of my life that I was actually either ashamed about or nervous about, or was afraid other people would find out about. So for years I did that, and I would have small victories with therapy, but didn't really actively use it properly. And then I ended up having a couple things come to a breaking point. I was in a very emotionally abusive relationship. It was actually abusive on several different levels. And that came to a conclusion, and I was really kind of at a loss because I didn't know how to handle it. I had also for several years had self-injury issues. I had really horrible self-esteem. I had really horrible self-image. I used to burn myself for years, and which was also the most hipster form of self-injury. Because I would go to I later went to support groups for it, and they would look at me almost like the nerd who's really into Wilco when I said I was burning myself. It's like, oh, you're not mainstream. You don't cut yourself. And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm sorry. But what started happening was I was having a hard time dealing with all those things. And then I was like, okay, a lot of that I kept internally. A lot of people didn't know how unhealthy my relationship was because I would hide it. Yeah. A lot of people didn't know about the self-injury because I would hide it. And I started talking to my friends very openly about it, like my friends in comedy. And then I started going, okay, while I'm glad I can talk with them, I also need to talk with somebody who does not have any natural reason to just have an affinity for me. They're just there to listen objectively. And I started getting into therapy at that point. And it was funny because I went to a therapist. His name was Rick. And initially I was very skeptical because he started out by saying, I am not a licensed psychiatrist. I'm just a therapist. And he said, and I used to be a minister. So immediately I'm like, oh God, he's going to be really judgmental. But then I'm like, you know what? I've already paid for the first session. Let me just do it.
Yeah.
And I find out the reason he had left the church was he was very, very much a proponent for gay rights, and basically didn't gel with the church. So that's why he left. Yeah. And I was like, okay, I can't really find a fault with that. That seems pretty cool. And then our first meeting, we start talking, and I'm like, well, what do you like to watch on TV? Just kind of being friendly. And he's like, The Wire. And I'm like, okay, if he's watching Stringer Bell, I'm pretty sure me saying fuck is not going to freak him out. So I started to actually be open with this guy. in a way that I had never been before.
Yeah.
And it was interesting too, because he had a good bullshit detector. And some of the stuff is even like comical looking back.
Mm-hmm.
When I got out of that relationship that was very emotionally abusive, it was funny because he tried to tell me, he's like, Michael, you were in a very emotionally abusive relationship. And I'm like, no, that's not true at all. So he brings out this book that had 14 different symptoms for emotional abuse. And if you had, I think, 3 to 5 of them, that was considered severe emotional abuse. So we go down the list and I had 13 of the 14.
Holy shit, dude.
And I'm trying to go, well, I didn't have all of them. And he's like, that's not okay. And then he goes, just out of curiosity, which one did she not do? And I go, well, she never kept me from my kids. I have 0 kids, by the way. Like, so he's like, okay, well, she doesn't get that one for free. That's all of them. Like, biological, biological impossibilities doesn't make it okay.
Holy shit, dude.
But it was a situation where you're like, the funniest thing about therapy is you don't go to like tell somebody your problems. You go to actually learn what your problems are. Like,
yeah,
because you really don't rationalize what they are until like you can actually speak it out with somebody. And that's the other thing too, is my therapist was not a guy who goes like, you should do this. He was very good at kind of teaching me to fish than giving me a fish.
That's a huge thing that a very intelligent therapist will do. Yeah, it's huge.
100%. Yeah. And I had therapists in the past that had certainly tried to do different exercises to kind of steer it in a certain direction. And that may work for some people. That was not going to work for me. It's hilarious. I had a notebook from when I had depression the first time I went to a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And nice guy, but I just was not using the therapy properly.
Yeah.
But he's like, are you having depression? And I said, yes. And he's like, have you ever had thoughts of suicide? And I said, yes, I do sometimes. And he said, well, I want to make a list of the things that you think are most worth living for. And I want you to just look at that list whenever you're having suicidal thoughts, which is not a bad inventory to make.
No, I think that.
So this list was made when I was like 13 or 14. Do you know what number 1 on my list was?
Oh man, I can only imagine.
It wasn't my family. It wasn't like a girlfriend. It was Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, because it was coming out in 6 months. Like, which if I had known then what I know now, I might not be around today. But like,
yeah. Oh yeah. But hey, listen, dude, as a fellow Star Wars fan and Star Wars geek, totally valid back then.
Yeah, especially at that age. Like, but it was certainly a process. It was a long process for me to become comfortable and for me to realize what a great tool to just talk openly with somebody and not have anything outside of that you have to worry about, and be able to really just kind of express what you're going through. And then how normalized it becomes as soon as you do therapy. Like, I would tell him feelings I would have, and I'm like, oh boy, he's really going to think I'm fucked up when he hears this. And it didn't even faze him because he's heard 30 other people say the same thing probably that week.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times with a good therapist is they want you to keep coming every week, because not every week you're going to be talking about something negative. They will start working in positive things. So then they get this nice, well-balanced view of who you actually are. So when you come out with something like you might think is outlandish, they're like, no, this is certainly in the realm of what this person is thinking. And in addition to what you had just said, they've heard so much stuff, because we always want to think that what's going on in our lives is so terrible, it's the end of the world. But in reality, there are people out there that would beg to have the fucked up shit that we have wrong with us.
Yeah, 100%. And it's always fascinating, because the more you talk to people that are in therapy, you find they're the people that are probably the most open about sharing the stuff. Now I don't mind talking openly about any of the struggles I've had. There were maybe 2 or 3 people that knew about my self-injury issues for years. And they were typically like people I slept with, because at a certain point they see burn marks and we're going to have a conversation. And outside of that, like, my mother didn't know, my father didn't know, my family didn't know. It was a very personal very traumatic thing, but like it was just something that I had to navigate on my own. And then I started talking to a therapist about it. And then I felt like, okay, I kind of don't want to come back here every week and say that I'm struggling with this. Like, and that actually motivated me to help. And then one of the other things that it helped me to do is my therapist, and this was genius. He said, have you talked to any of your friends about this? And I said, no. And they're like, promise me you'll talk to at least one of your friends when you leave this office about this.
Yeah.
And I did. And what I realized, and I don't know if he immediately knew this is what it would come to, but upon telling him, I'm like, okay, now that he knows, I feel less inclined to take that course of action because I feel like it'll hurt him too.
Yes.
And it was like that accountability was one of the biggest things that helped me overcome that. Is like, and it wasn't that my friends are going to go like, you're not burning yourself now, but I knew that like they were sad to hear that a friend had struggled with that. And I didn't want them to have to go through that anymore. And I realized that was more of a motivation for me to get healthy than even like doing it for yourself. Like I did it for myself to a certain degree, but that motivation of like the people in my life, I don't want to ever be subject to me not working on myself.
That is so huge to admit, because a lot of times in our lives, we want to do things for ourselves. That is always the key motivator. But there are certain situations that become so drastic that you can't help yourself. You have to help yourself because someone else is depending on you, or not depending on you, but your choices are dependent on how they react.
I mean, the best example is you see people with children where people make drastic changes because they don't want to create a toxic environment for their child.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful reason to get health, mental health help. Any reason that people get help for, any kind of mental health struggles, I think is wonderful. But a lot of times it's just caring for other people and you not wanting them to be subjected to something because you refuse to get help for it.
Yeah. I used to have a really bad drug problem, and I had overdosed twice. And the second time was really scary because both times I was alone. But the second time, when I would close my eyes, I literally would see white, and it freaked me out. And I did not go to sleep that night. And the thing that I was able to latch onto was the thought of the police having to call my parents and tell them that I had died. And that was the phone call. That was the situation, the scenario that I created in my head, where I was like, if you can't get off of drugs for yourself, then you have to do it for someone else. And that was the motivating factor. And so having your therapist tell you to tell a friend, that was huge. It was huge.
It was absolutely huge. And I think he also realized too, comedians pride themselves on just being an open book. But surprisingly, a lot of us aren't an open book about certain things because we feel very ashamed about it. And actually, like, he was almost challenging me to be more authentic in the thing that I loved. He said, all your comedian friends, go tell one of them. Go tell one of them like this thing. And us, like, anytime a comedian shares something that we didn't know about them, it's like so exciting because we do feel we know everything about these people. There's a weird intimacy comics have with each other that I don't think any other group of people have because of how openly they speak with one another. So it was really, really enlightening. And then it really became almost addictive to like take steps to make myself better. A lot of the things that I kind of held myself back because I was nervous to do so. I wanted to travel a lot. I'd never really traveled. I started traveling a lot immediately.
Mm-hmm.
I started making a lot of goals. I had always been really into comedy, but I started being even more succinct in what my comedy goals were. I think therapy helped all that. And it was funny because there's a lot of people that think like, well, you can't be funny unless you're miserable. I don't believe that at all. I think comedians need to know why people are miserable. I think having that empathy helps, but you don't have to just marinate in that all the time. You just have to be able to understand that.
Yeah, I think that the idea of the the depressed comic is something very outdated. I think it's cliche, and I think it's pretty hack, to be honest with you. You know,
I mean, I know great comics that are depressed, but I do feel confident that if they were to respond to that and find a healthy place, they would be just as funny. I mean, how many comics do you know that quit drinking? Their jokes didn't magically suck now.
Yeah.
You know, Dave Attell hasn't drank in years. Dave Attell still murders. Like, it's not a catch-all.
Yeah, you can't use your present circumstances to dictate your future outcomes, and you can't use it as a crutch. That's what it becomes. It becomes a crutch. You know, I think some of the best experiences that you can talk about are the things you struggled with, because in my thinking, there's going to be someone out in that audience that either went through it or knows somebody that went through it. And it doesn't have to be an exact replica of the same struggle, but it could be something similar. And if you can connect with them on a very deep and emotional, cerebral level, it's huge. I think it's so huge.
Yeah, they don't have to completely relate note for note with the scenario that occurred with you. It has to be that the same core feelings that you were feeling in that situation, they're able to tap into that.
Yeah.
You know, not everybody's had to deal with self-injury. But everybody's dealt with, I feel insecure. I feel like I don't have any friends. I feel like I don't have the same level of value that everybody else does. Those ideas people can tap into whether or not you think it's alienating or not. And the chances are they've had their own personal struggles that they would think that you would find to be the weirdest shit in the world that they're not sharing with you. Yeah. And it's, you know, we're all not that far apart from one another.
No, not at all. It's just the varying degrees of what we're willing to talk about and kind of what we went through. Everybody struggles. This world is too tough to not struggle. Everyone, I don't care. You could be from a family of that's a Fortune 500 company, but you're still going to have self-esteem issues. Am I enough? You're still going to have insecurities. You're still going to have those things. So it might not be on the same level, but it's to the varying degree. And that's really cool to say that. You know, what you just said, everybody's connected. Everything is very linear.
Yeah, I believe so.
Now, you had said something before about your parents helping you get into therapy. What was that like? Because I know for myself and people that I've talked to recently, parental support initially isn't always there when it comes to dealing with your mental health.
That's a great question. And I am kind of an anomaly because I do think mental health struggles, there's a little bit of nurture and a little bit of nature. I'm much more nature than nurture. Like, my parents got divorced when I was 11, and that probably had some level of impact. Mm-hmm. But my parents have also treated each other respectfully since the divorce, you know, outside of a few instances when they were going through the divorce, and that happens. But I honestly had a very charmed situation with my parents' divorce, because even though they're not together, they have like a respect for one another. And they both love their kids more than they wanted to use him as like a pawn against one another. My father was a little bit skeptical at first. You know, my father was resistant, but not to where he's not doing therapy. He definitely had to be convinced. My mom was on board right away. And my mom actually is a school counselor now. In fact, my emotional struggles is what kind of inspired her to go back to school and get a degree in counseling.
Wow.
Which is kind of beautiful. She wanted to understand her son better.
Yeah. Dude,
like that's you know, I can't ask for more than that. And my dad, honestly, like as I got older, my dad tried in his own way to like get to know me better. You know, and my dad and I are very close, even though we're very different in some ways. We're a lot alike. Both of my mom in particular was like, he's clearly struggling with something. I kept having teachers going like, he's one of the smartest kids in the class, but I can't get him to pay attention. You know, and it wasn't like even that I was cutting up and stuff. I mean, I would tell jokes and stuff. I was kind of a jokester then, but I was not alienating the class. It was just kind of like, we don't know. He's just kind of in a daze. So I went to therapy initially for ADD and I got medicated. And I think there are plenty of people that do have ADD, and I think it's a legitimate thing. I think in some ways I probably have it a little bit, but I think it was more I had depression, but at first we initially thought it was ADD because a lot of the symptoms can overlap.
Yeah.
And over time, I had spurts where I would go to therapy and then I would drop out. Most of the time early on, it was when I was causing enough friction in the house. It was pretty much like, you need to go to therapy or it's not going to work out. Not that they were going to kick me out, but it was going to be some other penalty or go to therapy.
Yeah.
And I started going to therapy then, and then I started going a little bit independently when I moved out. But I still was not quite at the point where I was ready to really be as open as you need to be for therapy to really work. And then it was like I said, I got into a relationship. I had always been kind of hard on myself. And then I dated several wonderful women prior to that, like not a ton, but every relationship I had, it was just compatibility issues, but we're good people.
Mm-hmm.
And then I dated somebody who was not a particularly good person, who was a very toxic person, who was very cruel in some ways, especially for somebody who was like a little more sensitive like I was. And after that relationship ended, I really was kind of a mess. And there were like several incidents, like there were times that she would just like, openly say very cruel things to me. And it was just expected that I was supposed to deal with it. If I ever recommended therapy to her, she's like, well, you're the one who goes to therapy. I don't need therapy, which also, like I said, is a hallmark that you probably need it badly. And I just felt like there was a lot of insecurity that was being taken out on me, but I didn't know how to voice it and I didn't know how to leave. In fact, one of the worst moments was, I told you I used to burn myself. She was one of the few people that knew. And there was one time, I remember when Robin Williams died, it like really messed with me. And not even because I was like the biggest Robin Williams fan, but he had actively tried to get help.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like, I'm a huge Nirvana fan, but Kurt Cobain frustrates me because I was like, man, I wish he would have just tried to get help. And I know it's not that easy. Sometimes you just can't bring yourself to do it.
Yeah.
But it upsets me so much because he was such a talented guy. Rob Williams, it hit me in the gut even more because I was like, he was doing everything in his power to try to get better and it just didn't work out. And that was, so when he died, that was like really overwhelming to me. And the person I was dating at the time got like angry and said like, why are you, I was like tearing up and she's like, why are you crying? You didn't even know Rob Williams. You need to chill out. Like you need to stop. So I locked myself in the bathroom and I told her to leave me alone. And she like slid a lighter under the door, like kind of mocking me about it. And which just devastated me because I'm like, why would anybody do that? That's not nice to do. And that wasn't the catalyst. That wasn't what finally ended things. But that was certainly a situation where I'm like, after I exited and looked back on that, I'm like, okay, that really fucked with my head. And I don't know how it wouldn't fuck with anybody's head. I need to talk to somebody about this. And it was even funny because when I first went to therapy, I was still like, okay, I'm going to tell you this. Not a big deal. Like,
don't want you to get concerned. It's okay.
It's cool. Like, but I explained that situation. I'm like, I kind of felt a little bad when this happened. And of course, my therapist is like, yeah, of course you did. Like,
Jesus Christ, dude. I am so sorry that you even had to go through that. That is one of the worst things I've heard someone do to someone else. Like, that's insane that the person that you would expect, your partner, that you would expect to be with you, to care for you, to console you in a very weak and vulnerable moment is like, hey, guess what? Suck it up, you little bitch. Here's a lighter. Go have some fun. You're like, what?
It was, well, and it affected, I'm in a relationship with somebody who is the exact opposite of that now. Like, she's one of the most selfless people I know. Like, I think if she thought she hurt my feelings, she would probably be more upset than I would be. Like, she's such a caring person.
Yeah.
And I can already pick up that Emily's probably similar, and Emily's awesome.
Totally.
Like,
yeah.
But like, so I have the exact opposite, but even small things, like she was an amazing cook. Like, I'll give her credit for that, my ex.
Yeah.
But I wanted to learn how to cook. But anytime I went in the kitchen, if I made any mistakes, she would just verbally just rip me apart. And it was like, well, of course I was making mistakes. It was my first time cooking, and nobody's an ace out the bag. And I was so insecure about cooking. I started cooking again with my current girlfriend during the pandemic. And like I was shaking, like my hand was shaking as I was like cooking. And
Sure.
like my girlfriend would come in the room and she's like, do you want any help? And I would almost kind of like be a little twitchy. And I would have to remind myself, oh, yeah, she's not going to berate you if you do this wrong. She'll be
Yeah.
like, oh, it's no big deal. Let's try again tomorrow and order a pizza tonight. It's mistakes happen. And it was just kind of deprogramming that
Yeah.
and understanding. And it's also great, too, because going to therapy, I would not allow myself to get in that kind of situation again. But, it took a lot of working on myself to get to a place where I could tell myself, yeah, you're not going down that road again.
Yeah. And it's amazing when you get to that point of realization as you're on this mental health journey. And like just hearing these stories now, one, I used to be a cook. So if you ever need recipes, I'll hook you up.
Nice.
Very easy stuff to make. But two, your ex flipping out on you, it's not, that's a reflection of the childhood she lived.
Yes.
That's how her household was if she was in the kitchen. So it's like going back to that episode with Tracy. People doing things is a reflection of them, not of you. And that's a huge
Yeah,
concept that I think a lot of us struggle with on a daily basis.
I think so too. I mean, it's very easy when somebody's exhibiting toxic behavior to think like, especially if there's somebody that can seem very gregarious to the public, and then in private, they seem entirely different. It's like, oh, everybody thinks they're really cool and thinks they're really nice or thinks they're very friendly. And, in this like very, very surface level meeting, like out in public, but these things are happening behind the scenes, it almost makes you feel like, am I just thinking it up? Or if they're getting along with everybody else, but not getting along with me. That's the thing too, is toxic people don't always just behave toxically with other people, with everybody. Sometimes
Right.
it's very particular. There are people that have been toxic to somebody in a relationship, and the next person they date, they don't exhibit those same traits. And that's what's creepy about it.
Yeah.
Is like, they can kind of, now I would still argue there's still probably subtly toxic things they're doing in that relationship too, but there are times where people just don't experience those same scenarios. Marilyn Manson recently, he got exposed for being a serial sexual predator and like abusive in relationships and stuff.
I remember.
But then one of his wives was like, listen, he never abused me. He did cheat on me all the time, but he never abused me. And she wasn't defending him. She completely believes all the other women. But that's the scariest thing, is they could abuse that person, they could abuse that person, and then this person, they could decide not to do it, and there's no rhyme or reason.
It's
Yeah.
so creepy that someone can go to that extreme, because there's certainly a breakdown. There's such a breakdown. And like, I don't know if he's in therapy, but like, he doesn't seem like the kind of person that would be apt to going to therapy. And just that's based on
No.
it's purely based on what you see physically and what you see like in the news. And that's it. But like, people like that, they're everywhere. They're
Yeah.
everywhere. And
Yeah.
that's a very frightening reality.
It's a very frightening reality. And, I think most people that have a deep sense of empathy, which I think, I'm happy I have a lot of empathy, but it could also be a challenge at times for different reasons. Other people, that don't have the same level of empathy, they can't necessarily relate when people are overly empathetic. But if you're a very empathetic person, anytime somebody wounds you like that, you take it so personally.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest things I learned in therapy early on is to be able to step back and evaluate why something is happening, why something's occurring.
Yes.
Because you don't get into the mechanics of that when you're like right in the middle of it.
No. Yeah. I'm a big proponent of journaling. And when I journal, I'll write out what I'm feeling or what's going on. And those sometimes tend to be the longest journal entries, because I go through what you just said. I ask the why. Why do I feel like this? All right. Well, then it's like a why to the why to the why. and you just keep digging and digging and digging and digging because you want to uncover. And I think that is one of the things that is brought out in therapy, where you really want to just find out the answers. You want to find out why this is happening so you can prevent it from happening again.
Yeah. I've always said this, the Marvel movies and all that.
Sure.
I always said that every comic's favorite superhero should be Iron Man, because the whole premise of Iron Man is the reason his armor keeps evolving is it's symbolic as his journey of becoming a better man, because he's a very flawed person when you first meet him. So each new model of the machine, he's becoming a new model of a man too. Wow. Like he's evolving himself. And, therapy is about building a better model to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Building something that's more efficient, building something that's more loving, and building something that, dare I say, is willing to have a level of vulnerability. And thankfully, like, there is a renaissance of that right now. If you look at a lot of like pop culture, like tough guys, it's a lot of these like vulnerable badasses. Like Tom Hardy's like a pretty vulnerable guy in a lot of his like macho, roles. And even like Keanu Reeves has like a little bit of like a vulnerability to him. And that's becoming a much more positive trait because people can't actually connect to that. I think it's a universal theme.
Yeah. You see it a lot. You see more of these big badass guys doing movies that humble them in the script.
Yes.
And I think that that's really powerful. I think it's really powerful stuff because we have always had this infatuation with celebrities in this country. We're very much Hollywood centric and we idolize celebrities almost to a fault. And so
they're the royal family of the US.
They are the royal family. Like people couldn't tell you who their local state government representatives are, but they could tell you what happened 2 weeks ago on Keeping Up with the Kardashians. It's so.
Well, that's the funny thing about me too. I'm like a huge film nerd, but like any gossip, I'm always like 6 months behind.
Yeah.
Like if you ask me like who Brad Pitt's dating, I don't have a fucking clue. But if you ask me what movie he's working on, I usually know the details of that because that's what I'm interested in.
Sure.
But it's so funny because like the personal life stuff, I've become less and less enamored with. Like, I just kind of want to see what they do. And I'm not judging anybody for it. I know Pete Davidson gets a lot of girls, but that's also because he's a New York comic. I'm in, comedy in New York. So I hear about that, but I don't really seek out that kind of information. But for a lot of people, I think they live vicariously through it in some way.
Yeah, I'm in this script writing course right now, and it's people latch on to two things in a show. They latch on to similar qualities in a character that they like presently, or they see qualities that they could be in that character. So it's like like what is and what could be. But you had said something before about this level of vulnerability, and I really was digging it. Because we are comics and our whole premise about getting on stage is being the most authentic version of ourselves. Now, being in therapy and being so open as you are talking about this stuff, do you find that therapy has allowed you to become more vulnerable on stage with what you want to talk about?
100%. And it's not even necessarily. Some of it is content. Some of it is content that I wouldn't discuss openly on stage before. I am willing to discuss now. But it's also this situation, if you're not handling your mental health and you have any kind of mental health struggle, you do walk around feeling almost at all times a level of judgment being placed on you. A lot of times it's not actually happening. I'm sure there's been times I've been in a room and I'm like, where I'm like, oh, they're all probably thinking about what garbage they are. And they're like, probably like, who's that guy? Like, and that's literally like, that's the extent of it. It's not bad or good. It's just very neutral. Having the freedom of that, where I can walk into a room and I don't feel people are necessarily thinking negative thoughts. And the important thing is not even whether or not I think they're having negative thoughts, but I'm not placing my value on whether they are or not.
Yeah.
Like, that's actually the important thing. is you don't want to tell somebody in therapy, like, nobody's thinking bad things about you. Nobody is. But also, in the event that they do, it's okay. As long as you're doing what's right and as long as you're doing what's decent, you need to be able to cope with that too. Like, and I was able to learn very early on that most people weren't thinking negative things of me in the way that I thought they were.
Sure.
But what I also had to learn to develop is that when they do, if you're doing what you feel is right, you need to be able to evaluate, always hear what people's critiques are, but don't take them to heart if you know in your heart that it's not who you are. Therapy definitely afforded me that, and it made me much freer as a comic.
Yeah. And that's a perfect sentiment for the question, because that's exactly what it is. And I find that people have such a victim mentality that if they hear anything negative, they become so insecure that it almost, whatever is being said to them is like, it's considered triggering,
Yeah.
And
I think, oh, sorry,
it's
man.
okay.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, they think it's triggering, or it becomes a triggering situation because they're not mentally and emotionally equipped to handle it, because they're not in therapy. Or if they're in therapy, they're bullshitting their therapist, like we had talked about in the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, I think the first stages of therapy, you're developing a way to avoid a lot of the things that are triggering you. And then after you've matured in therapy, it then becomes, okay, now we have to deal with the fact that sometimes you are going to encounter those things in the future. And what coping mechanisms can we have to make sure you can do that? I think one of the biggest things I got to take away from a therapy, he said, listen, you have clinical depression, but therapy, you can train yourself to realize that, being depressed all the time is a choice. Like, and not that it's not harder for some people, and not that people don't have severe wiring. Like, I think I have some wiring that's different, but you can choose to take steps to train yourself to be happy, even if that is not your first inclination. And it's always going to be a challenge. And there are certainly times it's harder than others. And I'm certainly not saying this is not a similar situation to when people try to argue foolishly, like homosexuality is a choice. I think people are inherently depressed a lot of times. They might have that inherent thing, but there are coping mechanisms you can have to not let it run your life. One of the things I say all the time is I say, I have depression, but I'm not a depressed person.
Yeah.
And that took a lot of work to be able to get to where I could say that honestly, but I can say that honestly.
Sure. And I think that is a huge thing to admit. One of the things I find very funny is when people are in bad situations or in tough situations or have negative emotions going on, they will never open themselves up to the positive aspects that are around them.
Yeah.
They won't say, like, this is something negative, but I feel positive about these other things that are also going on. It's having that positive mental attitude. And sometimes people think that positive thinking is a way to bullshit yourself and to avoid any of those negative emotions. When in fact,
well, and I think it becomes narcotic to almost just wallow in that too.
Yeah. And I think people get scared of acknowledging those negative emotions. They get scared of a negative situation. And I think by acknowledging the situation or the emotion, it takes the power away from it. And be like, yeah, you know what? This is a tough situation. This is really shitty, but I'm not going to let it dictate myself and how I feel about everything else that's going on.
I would agree with that. I also think, like, it also has shifted my perspective on who I look to as, like, kind of inspiring, or like figures that I like really kind of admire.
Sure.
There's people that I love, that I think have always seemed to walk like a very righteous path, or seem to be really caring, considerate, and seem to, like, I have a John Lewis tattoo. I adore John Lewis. But going through therapy, one of the things I've learned to adore even more, I guess you would be like a perfect example. People that have had these struggles, people that did have these challenges, and then took steps to get over it. and the argument is like, well, that person wasn't always perfect. And it's like, yeah, but that person shows that there's a path. If you were just like a perfect guy out the gate and you were like a good guy out the gate, then it would be like, well, that's just natural for him. There's no struggle there. But like, if I meet somebody and they're a great guy now, and then I find out in their past, they had several character things that they had to overcome, I have even more respect for them because I know how challenging it is to have to overcome those things. And it's like, okay, they got to a healthy place. They actually had to overcome an obstacle, in their character or personality that was very challenging. And that makes them instantly more interesting to me. And I think that's also something that's been a gift for comedy is, if you come on stage and go like, I have all the answers, that's not that compelling. But if you come on stage and go, hey, here's where I was trying to look for the answers, and I'm going to report to you why it failed in this instance. Yeah. And those failures can be hilarious, and they can almost be triumphs to a certain degree because people relate to things not working out the way they wanted to.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect thing to say. I mean, that's exactly, it's a great way of thinking. It's a great way of thinking because it helps people that are in the crowd latch on to what the comic is talking about. And all we're trying to do when we're up there is fucking connect with people. That's it.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think, and it's something where I think, and this is another reason I hope more comics get into therapy and things like that. Comics, if they're willing to use therapy properly, I think would get more out of it than your average person because they're willing to be open about a lot of things that people aren't to begin with. But I think just making that step is very scary for a lot of people. I mean, how many comics have you heard describe like, oh, I got laid last night. Oh, how was it? It's like, I came too quickly. Like, and if you hear your average guy say that, no average guy is ever going to speak a word of that if that happens.
Yeah.
But comics almost have this compulsive desire to like confess those sort of things. And that actually could be of a net benefit if they get in and utilize therapy properly, because that filter that would prevent them from being able to get that is even a little bit more removed. Once I opened the Pandora's box of therapy, I was like, open book.
Yeah. 100%. I could not agree more because I was in the same, not in similar situation to what you're talking about with yourself, but what we had talked about of almost skirting issues in therapy in the beginning. I'd been in therapy for 2.5 years until we hit on something from my childhood in June of 2020. And I told my therapist, I was like, don't let me run away from this. When we come back next week, this is what I want to talk about. And I want to continue to talk about it. And it was at that point where everything in my life shifted. My writing shifted completely. And everything in the world just opened up and got a little bit more colorful and a little bit more clear. And
see, you hit on something I think is very imperative. Where the turn happened for you was when you started taking a little bit of the driver's seat when it came to what you were doing your therapy for. Because at first when you go to a therapy, you're just kind of going like, let's throw all this on the wall and see what sticks. But then when you're coming in there with an objective, that's when a therapist can really do a lot for you. When you go, I know this is something, I want to kind of dive into this because I know there's like some meat on the bones there. That's when a therapist really can completely change your life in terms of how you perceive things.
Oh yeah. It's so huge. I used to be a serial dater. I had issues with monogamy. I was all over the fucking place. And we hit on this subject. My comedy changed. I got out of 2 relationships that I was in at the time. And then I was like, you know what? Let's let this calm down. Let's let this calm down right now and work on yourself. And wouldn't you know it, 2 months later, I met my current girlfriend, and the rest is history.
And it's beautiful. Like I love the emancipation that people get once they go into therapy and once they actually use therapy. There's one of the things that I've enjoyed about the episodes that you've done so far is just the freedom at which people can discuss these sort of things. And there seems to be a sense of relief in their voice when they come on, and a lot of that is because they are able to reflect on what led them to therapy. And clearly what led them to therapy was usually a tumultuous time, a chaotic time, and a time where they felt like they didn't have much control in their life. And it seemed pretty bleak and hopeless. And most people, when they're talking openly about therapy, there's always a level of, okay, there is a game plan that we can have to resolve this. And that's something that's, I'm not saying that people can't get it without therapy, but you could save yourself a lot of time if you're just willing to find somebody to talk to.
Yeah. And that's really what it is. We get to these moments, we get into these situations in our own lives where we just lose control. We lose control. We don't know how to get it back. And I think everyone, to a certain extent, is a control freak. They want to have control of their own life. And when they lose that control, that's when you see them, turn to hurting themselves. Alcohol, drugs, abusive relationships, anything to fill the void or anything to give them control over something else in their life. And therapy helps reel them back in. And it's a perfect segue into what I wanted to say next. And that is, I wanted to applaud you. I wanted to applaud you for
Thank you.
being on this podcast today. I wanted to applaud you for your mental health journey, because I would have never known any of the things that you had gone through if we didn't sit down today. So kudos to you for being on this journey over these years of rebuilding your life.
I appreciate that. And I want to thank you for doing this podcast in general. Like, I think it's a conversation that a lot of us have, but I think it would be a benefit for people to know that there's a conversation that's constantly occurring, not just in comedy, but in a lot of walks of life now. And I feel a lot of people are on these journeys, or some are even on these journeys and not even aware of it. And I think to create an environment where you can normalize therapy and really express the benefits and really have case studies of how it has benefited people will not only encourage more people to go into therapy, but also if they're feeling a little reticent about their first therapy experience or things like that, then give them a little bit more comfort in knowing that there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, there is certainly nothing wrong with asking for help in your own personal life. Now, we're coming to a close in this episode. We're coming to a close for this podcast today. And I always end with two questions called 2 for 2.
Sure.
First question is, if you could describe therapy in one word, what would it be?
I would say liberating. I think it helps you remove a lot of barriers in your life. I think it opens things up, and I think it makes you more accessible to other people.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It is very liberating, and it's amazing how going into therapy, pulling out possibly one little, what you think is a minor roadblock, opens up a whole highway of emotions inside of you, which is huge. That's very well said. Thank you. And the next question is, if you knew somebody that was on the fence about going to see a therapist, they weren't sure what to do, what's some encouraging words that you might have for them? What's some advice that you might be able to give them about being in therapy?
The worst scenario that you think would happen is if you shared something with a therapist, I guarantee you is not going to be as haunting to them as you think it is. They're there to hear whatever you think is the things that nobody should be shared with, and to prove to you that you aren't alone in having those feelings. They've had multiple people that have had those same struggles, and I always say, give it 3 sessions. Give 3 sessions where you're just like, I am going to be completely open no matter what it is, and see how it feels. And I would argue 99% of the time, if people are willing to actually not only go to therapy, but actually do therapy right and be that open book, they will only benefit from it.
That's awesome. That's absolutely amazing. I love that thinking, and I love that mindset, because it is 3 sessions. I think 3 sessions would give somebody a good, accurate opinion of one, the therapist that you're talking to, and their level of comfortability.
Absolutely.
That is perfect. That is absolutely perfect. Well, Mike, thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and appreciate you talking about your struggles, because I know someone out there that's listening will be able to relate to this, or they know someone that is struggling with this, and hopefully they find some comfort in being able to move forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. I'm very happy to hear you're doing very well as well. And that's always a positive thing to hear.
My man. Thank you so much, Mike. It was great talking to you, and I will catch up with you soon.
Talk to you later, man.
I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us on this mental health journey. My name is Ralph Anthony, and this has been another episode of Unmasking the Mic. We'll be back next week with a brand new interview. Until then, stay present, stay in the moment, and keep your head up. Peace.